Previously on Millennial Model Mayhem.
It's not my favorite, Gushin.
That honor would have to go to this absolute unit, which I'm still trying to get my hands on.
Oh lord, he out of stock.
Hello people, my name is Liam, and welcome to Millennial Model Mayhem. After much waiting, I can finally say... Gundam Gushin ga kita! So in this video, I will be hand painting and kit bashing this gloriously rotund and extra high-grade Gunpla model kit for tabletop gaming purposes. Like with many of my other custom Gunpla projects, this one will end up with a proper loadout and pilot profile for the game Gamma Wolves by Ash Barker. All the Gunpla projects I've customized for tabletop gaming in the past were done with similar use of edge highlighting and glazing, among other hand-painted techniques that I've been casually referring to as Model Mayhem style. There's a playlist on my channel featuring all those videos if you want to check it out after this. Now, the Gushin is going to be part of an all-new crew to go alongside the previous crews, the protagonists and the antagonists. So I'm taking this as an opportunity to once again get out of my comfort zone and try out some freehand painting, which I haven't done on Gunpla before. And I'm also going to do a new gradient pattern for the base. It's been a while since the last video like this, so please sit back and relax and enjoy some tranquil clacks. The Gushin originally appeared in episode 11 of Mobile Suit Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans and was designed by Ippei Gyobu. There is already so much I love about this model kit straight out of the box. Just witness those big, curvy armor panels, high heels, and the overall chunky frog look. The ridiculously proportioned hammer is amazing, so I'm letting that guide me through customizing this thickie into an intimidating melee powerhouse. Just gotta add these forbidden sprinkles to the collection first. Don't eat them. Some of you may have noticed the very early stages of the kit bashing process during this live stream where I built this high-grade Guels de Lanza from the new anime series The Witch from Mercury. I enjoyed watching the first season, and I recommend you check it out if you're looking for some fresh mecha anime. Also, the box art for this series is good.
Say it with me, people. Real grade box art is bad.
I had a good time building this new model and was impressed with the efficient engineering that used no amount of rubbery polycaps. It didn't stay in its regular state for too long though, as my intention was always to use it to enhance the Gushin. Thankfully, a lot of the pieces can be easily swapped between the two, so a good portion of kit bashing can be done before any glue or modifications are required. I'm swapping the Gushin's arms with the Dilanza's, primarily because the original wrist guards would get in the way of posing the hammer. The big movable shoulder pieces are not being used, however, more about that soon. The other Dilanza piece being used is the fancy plumed helmet, which immediately transforms the vibe from frog to beetle. Perhaps one reason the Dilanza works well with the Gushin is that it also was designed by Ippei Gyobu. Just look at how good these casually combined leftovers look. Last thing before I get to the actual modifications, a quick trip to the Gundam graveyard. For this model's base, I've got the usual 100mm Reaper Minis product, and then for the other pieces I'm using, just a few tiny morsels from the bits box, as well as this big axe from this high-grade Zaku 2 high mobility type. It's this one, the Principality of Zeon Black Tri-Star's Use Mobile Suit Ortega. Then the Gelgoog will get back to the drawer cuddles soon enough because I'm just using the shoulder pads. I need them for their large, flat surfaces. The Gushin isn't great at doing two-handed poses with its hammer. This is partially due to the wrist guards, but primarily because of the short handle length. So after sawing away the handles from both the axe and hammer, I sanded the attachment points flat and took a knife to the nub marks. Then I used plastic cement to get the longer handle onto the hammerhead and fuse the parts together for eventual seamline removal. That's all the weapon kit bashing done now because the Gushin's chest has some neat gun barrels built in already, and that'll suffice for secondary weaponry on this melee fighter. However, because I took away the original shoulders, these knobby bits on the top don't fit in as much. My solution to this is to replace them with these vent pieces that originally came from a real grade Astray's foot. After cutting away the vent details and sanding them down until they fit the contour of the back, I attached them with super glue. Moving down to the booty, I wanted to add some detail to fill the void created from the shell-like back piece, so I removed the pegs from these pipes that were from a hanger model, sanded underneath to fit the slight curve, and then slapped it right on there with some super glue. For the legs, I didn't want to add any new details, but I wanted to try a quick and lazy joint extension to make the feet and knees just a bit more visible. I did this by liberally applying superglue to the joint attachment points, then attaching the corresponding polycaps, but intentionally not sliding them on all the way. If the legs for this model weren't going to be secured to a base, I probably would have put in a bit more effort for a proper, more stable joint extension. The last element to kit bash are the shoulders. With the Gelgoog shoulder plates, I removed this inner joint piece and cut it down so I could glue it onto the Gushin's body and start eliminating some of the void between the torso and shoulder. Then I cut down the Dilanza shoulders to make room for the Gelgoog pieces and attach them with super glue, making sure not to accidentally lock the bicep joint with excess glue. At the last minute, I decided to go back to the bits box and glue these hand armor pieces into this convenient gap in the shoulder to help further disguise the void between it and the torso.
Yep, that's right, I'm still channeling my lazy kit bashing energy with all these big blobs of super glue.
Your Gundam, your way.
More like,
Your model, your mayhem.
as is often the case with my projects, I'm relying on the painting itself to distract from any imperfections that might be there in the plastic. And I think with this project in particular, it'll be a really good example of this strategy that I find to be quite effective. With that being said, now that the kit bashing is done, there is a bit of standard cleanup that I'm gonna do. So I'm gonna get to sanding.
Very happy with how everything looks put together. The two-handed hammer holding ability is definitely improved, so the last thing to do before painting is seam removal with super glue on the shoulders, legs, and hammer, as well as the usual basic nub removal and sanding. No experimenting or revolutionary techniques here, so check out my previous video if you want a bit more explanation of these steps. While I'm working here, I'll take the opportunity to show you the official loadout for this model in Gamma Wolves. but I'm saving the pilot and mecha's name reveal for closer to the end. Better keep watching. Usually during this stage I will be locking some parts of the model in place, but like with my previous video, I'm trying to see how little gluing I can get away with doing without having to worry too much about movable parts damaging the fragile acrylic paints I use. However, as I said before, this kit badge is being attached to the base because I like the stability it provides for using it as a gaming piece, and also makes handling during the painting process easier. Other than that, and securing the helmet's horn, which obviously doesn't involve any articulation, I'm going to try and get as much posability as possible. Hence why I'm doing more disassembly than I usually do before airbrushing. In what is now practically Model Mayhem tradition, I'm starting the painting process with Vallejo Black Surface Primer, followed by some shifter paint for the inner frame and the insides of various crevices and cavities. This time I went with Violet Old Copper. Once that's had time to cure, I've got to see how the paint holds up to reassembly. It's looking fine overall, but despite my best efforts, there were a few areas where plastic rubbed together and pulled up the paint. I could have maybe prevented this by sanding these areas down beforehand, but I just really don't like sanding. Obviously, this was a risk I was willing to take and had no problem in gluing the problem area on the upper knee joint and forward elbow joint. On the elbow joint in particular, I pretty much knew that I would have to use glue. I was mostly just painting it in the sub-assembly in order to get proper paint coverage for the bicep piece, which does retain its articulation. I just have to be careful and not bend it all the way where the parts will rub together. Once the glue had dried, I reapplied primer with a brush to the damaged areas, as well as spots where the airbrush had failed to get good coverage, and then brushed on a couple layers of the shifter paint. The shifter paint definitely doesn't look as good when it's brushed on, but the inferior texture won't be noticeable in this mostly concealed area inside the leg. Right after, I applied some Secret Weapon Dark Iron to break up the monotony of Violet Old Copper in a few places. Then I covered all the metallics in Nuln Oil to help bring out the recessed details. That's it for metallic paints, so it's time to bring out the WAP. Before any of the exciting paint work is done, I've obviously got to lay down some foundations with Vallejo Game Color Black and P3 Sanguine Base. I knew I only wanted one main color for this model because there was going to be a lot of visual details across the armor. And this red wine-esque shade was selected by my supporters on Patreon via a poll. Now, grabbing the old Vallejo Game Color Night Blue, the new Game Color Magic Blue, and Model Color Sky Blue with our good friend Glaze Medium, it's time to put aside the mecha for a moment and take care of the round base. I'm going for a similar vibe to what I did with the turquoise gradients on my other Gamma Wolves, but since this one will be the start of a new crew, I wanted to give the gradient a proper pattern that would be more practical for use in games. More on that in a moment. The process here is practically the same as with the turquoise bases, starting with laying down the 3 gradient colors, making sure the light shade borders the dark shade of the neighboring shape, and then with the aid of the wet palette and glaze medium, slowly blending those colors together into a nice vibrant gradient pattern. I went with blue this time because it goes well with a decent variety of other colors, thus giving me flexibility when I get to make the following members of this new crew and choose colors for them. Back to the quadrant pattern of the base for a moment. Gamma Wolf's rules for base arcs works like this, with the model's front arc being a cone, but since the head for my model will be posable, I'll be able to move it to represent a different system where there is a left and right front arc.
Perhaps in my very own models agnostic game. Wouldn't that be neat? Anyways, now that the base coat and the base's coat of paint are done, it's time to glue those feet down and get to edge highlighting. Attaching the model to the base should be the last part to be glued to anything, and because I didn't glue the feet to the ankles with this project specifically, I am able to detach the legs from the base to more easily access those feet for the edge highlighting. Next, Magic Blue is being applied to the eyes and thrusters to be the foundation for my typical glowing effects.
After that, the first and thickest edge highlights are being done for the red, which is using the straightforward P3 Sanguine highlight, and the black highlight gets a mix of black and P3 Ironhull Gray. The following edge highlighting steps were to go over all the Sanguine again with a thinner line using a roughly 2-to-1 mix of Sanguine highlight and Golden High Flow Naphthol Red light. Then the black armor was completely finished with 2 more rounds of edge highlighting, the first being a smaller line of straight up Ironhull Gray, then a 50-50 mix of that gray with high flow titanium white is applied to just the intersections and corners to accentuate the sharpness. These techniques are basically the same as with all my other hand-painted projects, just with slightly different paints. I try to get through these early base coating and edge highlighting stages fairly quick because, like I said back during the kit bashing, the details I'm finishing the red armor with will be quite distracting. As you can see here, my nails were painted to complement the armor during the corresponding edge highlighting streams. Burp 2. That's right, it's freehanding time. My initial idea for the freehanding came from the Warhammer Fantasy 7th Edition Empire Army book with this miniature here. And it's like I managed to find a way to reference Warhammer Fantasy in every single video at this point. This led me to do some real-life historical research into late medieval and Renaissance plate armor, like the foot combat armor of Prince Elector Christian I of Saxony. If you couldn't tell from this and the last video, I'm a bit of a historical nerd in addition to being a science fiction and fantasy nerd. Finally, I studied the miniature painting freehand work of Brad Glover Kit Bash, and the vibrant Tau Force of theirs, and friend of the channel Fiverr, aka Sugar Candy Miniatures, Strawberry Knight. Links for both these artists' work will be in the description, and I highly recommend you check them out. I used straight up Naphthol Red light to paint in the designs. I did a little bit of test sketching on paper beforehand, but only to get a general sense of the shapes I wanted to adhere to. This process can definitely be described as winging it, like with a lot of my work. I merely added curvy lines, spirals, hooks, points, and little apostrophes within the previous edge highlights in ways that I thought went along well with the contours of the armor. I was fairly nervous to get started with this stage, but after the first few sections had their fancy designs painted in, I quickly got into a flow state and had a great time adding all the detail. As much as I did enjoy doing all the freehand without a plan to follow, I did make sure the lines were fairly symmetrical across both sides of the armor. If you take a really keen eye to the freehand work, the opposite sides don't exactly match each other, but there are only a few angles that the model can be looked at where 2 symmetrical sides can be observed at the same time, and when it's all finished, I will once again make the point that the overall paintwork will be distracting from imperfections like that. When the freehand designs were finished being drawn in, I went over all of it a second time with a roughly 2-to-1 mix of model color pink and Naphthol Red light. I used a smaller brush here and mostly did one coat so that the original red layer would show through and provide more visual interest to the lines. I could also use this stage to slightly correct the thickness of the red lines at points to look a bit more symmetrical from a distance. Like I did with the final edge highlight on the black armor, I used this same mix of pink and red to edge highlight the intersections and corners on the armor. Furthermore, this model is a bit more posable than my usual Gamma Wolf's fare, so like with my last project, the Shimazu Astray, I'm approaching the edge highlight placement more neutrally as opposed to according to the pose. Once that second pass on the freehand was done, I went back to the helmet's big feather and gave it a base coat of Xeris Purple. Once that purple was dry, I applied some heavily thinned Night Blue to sink into all the recessed areas. To highlight the raised details, I gradually mixed in some pink with the purple for 2 rounds of fast and light horizontal brush strokes. Some of these brush strokes were following the broad details already sculpted onto the feather, but I'm also using the brush to add more details and texture in order to hopefully make it look more like a feather and not a piece of plastic masquerading as a feather. After the feather was done, I grabbed the blue gradient used on the base, minus the darkest night blue, and started building up the glow effects for the eyes and back and leg thrusters. This is very much the same process I've used on my other hand-painted projects, build up the gradient to white on the light source itself, and then glaze the surrounding area with heavily diluted paint in a slightly darker gradient. I found the cavities for the leg thrusters a little more difficult than usual to glaze around this time, but I'm still satisfied with the result I got. I could have stopped the painting here, but because I'm a masochist, I did another round over the freehand with Sanguine Highlight. I found that the first rounds of red and pink stood out a bit too much against the regular edge highlighting work, and the Sanguine Highlight is transparent enough that those original tones still show through. And I think the way it toned everything down improved the overall consistency of the armor. As the painting is wrapping up, I'd like to acknowledge the kind support of my patrons over at patreon.com/millennialmodelmayhem, where you can find early access to content and special benefits, now including Patreon exclusive videos. It's by far the best way to support me, especially if you join the Mayhem Machines Bo and Muspelheim, or the Gog Hand Janelle and Sukasa WM. I reworked the page at the beginning of the year with things like those exclusive videos I just mentioned, so if you're interested in helping keep the content zone afloat, please check out patreon.com/millennialmodelmayhem. When I finished the painting on this project, I kind of thought to myself, it kind of reminds me of Sports Max from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 6. Now you're probably thinking, oh, is that the silly character that's going to be the pilot for this thick mech? No. In honor of Honor Among Thieves, the new live-action D&D movie, this dummy thick mecha will be piloted by an equally as chonky red dragon, Thembershad. It's pretty much the best part of the movie, in my opinion, so highly recommend just for that scene alone. Of course, my fanfiction version of Thembershad to pilot this mech is like a humanoid-sized dragonborn type creature, so it could actually fit inside the mech. Also, look, I didn't reference a Warhammer Fantasy book.
Wow.
Now when it comes to naming the mecha itself, the Gushin has a pretty interesting demonic origin to its name, like many of the mobile suits in Iron-Blooded Orphans. However, I feel the freehand work I did alongside the armor I found inspiration through gives everything a lot more of a regal vibe, so it shall therefore be named the Martellus. It's a variation of a Latin word that means hammer. Now it's time for some protective matte varnish, and then we shall see the beauty shots. As much as I love the original design of the Gushin, I saw untapped potential in that hefty hammer and thought that, with the help of Guel's de Lanza, I can transform that into a noble melee fighter. And I'd say I did. All the ideas that formed in my head in the lead up to actually executing the kit bash worked out like I hoped they would. Like with practically all of my projects, there are some imperfections here and there from things like paint inconsistency or mishandling, but I always remind myself of the actual distance that most people will be looking at the model, because at least in my case here, the painting itself has enough detail to draw the eye, and there isn't anything wrong with having a few imperfections here and there. I'm so glad I took the chance of trying something new with the freehand painting on this hammer-wielding chonkster. This is definitely another one of those projects that I've been planning and working on for so long that I feel like a burden has been lifted. While at the same time, I'm kinda sad it's over. The next few video projects that are already in progress are a brief departure from hand-painted Gunpla because my brain likes to have the variety, but I'm also looking forward to painting the next crew member to go alongside the Martellus, who will most certainly have freehand designs as well. Oh, my thick, beautiful filigreed boy, I hope to soon cast the dice of fate upon the battlefield and witness the destruction of our enemies upon your mighty hammer. Thanks for watching this far into the video. If you'd like to support the work I do, there are a number of ways to do so. In addition to enhancing my Patreon at the beginning of the year, I've now set up a Ko-fi page for one-time donations. Is that how you say it? Or is it coffee? Or Ko-fi? Anyways, so you can do donations through there if you prefer not to use the YouTube Super Chat or Super Thanks method. And I'll have a few more updates regarding methods like this to share in the next project. But if you prefer not to donate monetarily or anything like that, there's always the good old like, comment, share, and subscribe here on YouTube. There's some other links that you can check out in the description, like affiliate links. You can also follow me on social media. And of course, if you want to be the first to know what's coming next in the Content Zone, you can support me on Patreon. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoyed seeing my process. Gianni!